When I look back on my childhood, I often wonder if I was ever truly seen by my parents. My name is Emily Carter, the eldest daughter in our small traditional household. From the outside, our family looked ordinary. 2 parents, 2 daughters, a modest home on a quiet street. But what outsiders never saw was the silent war that grew inside those walls. Being the eldest meant I was born with expectations. I was supposed to be the responsible one, the role model, the obedient child. At first I tried. I really did. I studied hard. I helped with chores. I even looked after my little sister Lisa when my parents were too busy. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Lisa was different. She was the golden child, the apple of their eye. Everything she touched turned to praise. When she scribbled a crooked drawing in kindergarten, it was framed on the living room wall. When I won first place in a school spelling bee, it was brushed aside with a simple, "Good job, Emily. Now go do your homework." The comparisons became a constant drumbeat in my life. Why can't you smile like Lisa? Why do you always argue? Lisa never gives us trouble. It was as if my worth only existed in contrast to hers, and I always came up short. I remember one night when I was about 12. Dad had come home late from work, tired and irritable. Lisa ran to greet him with a hug, and he laughed, scooping her up as if she were made of gold. Then I approached him with my report card, proudly showing him all my A's. He barely glanced at it before saying, "That's what we expect from you, Emily. Nothing special about that." That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why trying so hard still left me invisible. It was the first time I felt the sting of resentment, not just toward my parents, but toward Lisa. She wasn't a bad sister, not really. But she basked in the glow of their attention, and deep down, I think she knew I lived in her shadow. She never once told them, "What about Emily?" She just smiled and let the imbalance grow. As the years passed, the gap widened. I learned to hold my tongue, to swallow my hurt, but inside a storm brewed. Every compliment Lisa received was a reminder of what I would never have. Every scolding I endured reinforced the idea that I was the family's disappointment. By the time I was 15, I realized something. Love in my family wasn't unconditional. It was a transaction. Lisa gave them adoration, and in return, she got affection. I gave them effort, and in return, I got silence. And that silence would follow me, shaping the person I was becoming. Growing up, I often felt like I was living in someone else's shadow. My parents' attention, their warmth, even their patience, it all seemed to orbit around my younger sister Lisa. And me? I was the quiet planet left in the dark, circling their world without notice. Lisa was born when I was 6 years old, and from the very beginning, she was treated like a miracle. My parents showered her with affection, toys, and praise. If she so much as sneezed, Mom rushed to wrap her in a blanket, cooing as though she had done something extraordinary. Meanwhile, I learned to handle my own scraped knees, my own tears, my own disappointments. As the older child, responsibility became my role, not love. By the time I was 10, I was helping with laundry, setting the table, watching Lisa when my parents were out. And yet, instead of recognition, I only received more expectations. If Lisa spilled her milk, I was scolded for not keeping an eye on her. If she cried, I was blamed for not being patient enough. The contrast was stark, and it hurt more than I can explain. I still remember one summer afternoon. Lisa and I had both drawn pictures. Mine was a careful sketch of a tree with branches, leaves, and shading. Hers was nothing more than stick figures and random scribbles. But when we showed them to Mom, she gushed over Lisa's drawing, taping it proudly to the refrigerator. "Mine?" She glanced at it, muttered, "That's nice," and left it on the counter. I stood there quietly, my heart sinking, realizing that my effort would never shine brighter than Lisa's mere existence. Over time, I began to hide my accomplishments. What was the point of sharing them if they didn't care? When I got a perfect grade on my math test, I stuffed it into my backpack. When my teacher praised me for helping other students, I kept it to myself. At home, my achievements were invisible, and invisibility became my defense. But being invisible has a cost. Inside, I was screaming for someone to notice me, to ask how I felt, to care. I wanted my parents to see that I was more than a set of chores and responsibilities. I wanted them to love me the way they loved Lisa, freely, joyfully, without condition. Instead, they compared us constantly. "Lisa has such a sweet smile, Emily. Why do you always look so serious?" "Lisa makes friends so easily, Emily. You should learn from her." Every word chipped away at my confidence. I started to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't lovable. Maybe I wasn't enough. I withdrew into books, into daydreams of a different life. Sometimes I imagined running away, finding a place where people valued me for who I was. But I was too young, too scared. So I stayed, swallowing the bitterness, hiding the jealousy that I hated to admit. Lisa, of course, seemed blissfully unaware. She floated through childhood carefree, while I carried the weight of responsibility and neglect. And as much as I tried not to resent her, part of me couldn't help it. She got the love I craved, and I was left with the silence. That silence was deafening, and little by little, it shaped me into someone I didn't recognize. By the time I entered my teenage years, the invisible chains of expectation had grown heavier, almost unbearable. My parents saw me as the responsible one, the good child, the obedient daughter, the one who had to set an example for Lisa. And they reminded me constantly. Every action, every decision, seemed to carry their silent, unspoken judgment. I had to be perfect, not for myself, but to uphold a standard I had never asked for. School became a balancing act. I studied tirelessly, participated in clubs, volunteered for every project, all while keeping a careful eye on Lisa. If she needed help with homework, I dropped what I was doing. If she wanted me to attend a school event she couldn't handle alone, I went without complaint. I convinced myself it was my duty, but deep down, resentment festered. I wanted my parents to see that I was struggling too, that I deserved care, that I was human. But whenever I tried to speak up, I was met with gentle dismissal. "Oh, Emily, don't be silly. Lisa needs you more." The pressure wasn't just emotional. Household responsibilities were endless. By 14, I was cooking meals, cleaning the house, grocery shopping, and making sure Lisa was always presentable. There were nights I would fall asleep on the couch after scrubbing the kitchen floor, only to be awakened hours later by my father asking if I had done the laundry. And yet, if I complained, I was accused of being ungrateful. I started to feel invisible in my own home, a ghost tasked with keeping everyone else happy. The contrast between Lisa and me grew clearer with every birthday, every holiday. Her achievements were celebrated extravagantly. If she won a school award, the house would fill with balloons and congratulations. When I won anything, the praise was muted, merely polite acknowledgement before life's duties dragged me back into the shadows. And though I loved my sister, I couldn't help the pang of bitterness that flared every time my parents called her gifted, special, or our little treasure. I tried to escape into Friends, but even there I carried the weight of home. I couldn't fully relax. Guilt followed me like a shadow. My parents expected constant updates, and I felt tethered to their world, as if my own life was not my own. I watched other teenagers laugh, explore, and make mistakes, while I walked a narrow path of responsibility. Every misstep at home had consequences that rippled through the household, and I had learned the hard way that perfection was never rewarded, only expected. By the time I was 16, I had become skilled at hiding my emotions. I could smile when praised, nod politely, and suppress the anger, sadness, or frustration that bubbled beneath. I became a master of appearing fine, while inside I felt the crushing weight of being everything to everyone, yet nothing to myself. And yet, despite the pain, despite the resentment, a small ember of hope burned within me. A hope that one day, someone would see me, not just as the responsible daughter, the caretaker, or the invisible twin, but as Emily, a girl with dreams, emotions, and a life that mattered. But that hope was fragile, and the years ahead would test just how strong it really was. It was the summer before my final year of high school when the cracks in our family began to widen. I had always sensed tension between my parents and Lisa's future husband, but I chose to ignore it. After all, what teenager wants to pry into adult matters? I was too busy juggling school, household duties, and the quiet, gnawing ache of being overlooked. But one evening, everything became painfully clear. I had returned from a part-time job, exhausted, only to find my mother in the living room, her eyes red from crying. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude, but something in her expression told me that the house had shifted. Something was about to break. "Emily," she said softly, beckoning me closer. I obeyed, though my instincts screamed to stay away. I don't know how to tell you this, but you need to be careful. Lisa's fiancé, he isn't who he seems. Lisa's fiancé, he isn't who he seems. I froze. My mind raced. I had noticed odd behaviors. Late-night phone calls, whispered conversations between Lisa and him when they thought I was asleep, and small but frequent arguments that I hadn't paid attention to. But my mother's words gave everything a terrifying clarity. "He's after the inheritance," she whispered, gripping my hand. "Your father, I think he trusts them too much. But mark my words, Emily, if we're not careful, they'll take everything." My chest tightened. I wanted to ask questions, to demand details, but my mother shook her head. "Not now. Just watch and trust your instincts." That night sleep eluded me. I wandered through the silent house, replaying every conversation, every moment I had observed my sister and her fiancé. Subtle signs now screamed betrayal. His charm, the flattery, the way he subtly undermined my father's opinions while making Lisa feel dependent on him. I had never doubted Lisa's judgment before, but now I saw the cracks, the manipulation, the hidden intentions that even my parents had only begun to suspect. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself becoming a silent guardian. I watched, listened, recorded small details, and tried to warn my father subtly, but he dismissed my concerns. "Emily, you're imagining things," he said with that familiar weary patience. "Lisa loves him. That should be enough." I realized then that my voice, as long as it was cautious and careful, could be ignored. And yet my mother's warning had planted a seed, a relentless awareness that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Every dinner became a performance, every smile a mask. I pretended to be the obedient daughter, while secretly gathering the pieces of evidence, the subtle clues, the tiny betrayals that hinted at a much larger plan. By the end of that summer, I understood something crucial. Loyalty and love could be twisted, and those we trusted most could be the ones willing to betray us for their gain. It was a lesson that would shape the rest of my life, harden my resolve, and prepare me for the storm that was about to engulf our family. And I knew, though I didn't yet know how, that my role in protecting what mattered most would demand sacrifices I wasn't sure I could make. By the time autumn arrived, the atmosphere in our house had shifted from uneasy to downright hostile. Every morning felt like walking into a battlefield where smiles were weapons and silence was a trap. I could feel it. The tension was thick, curling around the furniture, seeping into conversations, and making even casual remarks feel like accusations. Lisa had changed too. She was no longer the bubbly, carefree sister I once knew. Her laughter had become rehearsed, her gestures calculated. I caught her more than once glaring at my father with a thinly veiled contempt, and I noticed her eyes darting to her fiancé's phone as if seeking silent instructions. It was hard to watch. I wanted to confront her, to ask why she was letting herself be manipulated, but I was also painfully aware of my own vulnerability. Speaking up too loudly could draw suspicion, or worse, anger. My father, usually the pillar of calm and reason, was becoming increasingly irritable. Small mistakes, misplaced keys, late dinners, minor disagreements, sparked arguments that seemed disproportionate. I tried to comfort him, to lighten the tension, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. He trusted Lisa implicitly, and I could see how that trust was slowly being twisted, strained, almost broken. One evening, the argument escalated beyond the usual simmering frustration. Lisa and her fiancé cornered my father in the study, speaking in tones that were deceptively calm but unmistakably aggressive. I watched from the hallway, heart pounding, as the discussion turned to the topic of our family assets. My father's face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, while my mother, usually the voice of reason, stood quietly in the corner, her eyes downcast but sharp. "You need to think about the future," her fiancé said smoothly, leaning slightly toward my father. "It's only logical to arrange things so everyone is protected. Appropriately." I clenched my fists. The words were innocent enough to outsiders, but I could hear the hidden meaning: control, manipulation, and the subtle suggestion that our father's decisions were insufficient. That night, I barely slept. I paced the empty rooms, reliving every word, every gesture. It was clear now that Lisa and her fiancé were orchestrating a plan that could leave my parents powerless, stripped of both respect and resources. And while my mother had warned me, my father remained unaware of the full scope, trusting blindly, unable or unwilling to see the danger right in front of him. The next few weeks were a blur of calculated smiles, whispered conversations, and my growing anxiety. I felt like a spectator trapped in a play where I knew the ending, but everyone else was performing blindly. Every gesture, every comment, every seemingly innocent dinner became loaded with meaning. I learned to speak carefully, to ask subtle questions, to probe without revealing my growing suspicion. By the end of the month, I realized that I couldn't remain a silent observer any longer. Something had to be done, but I had to be smart. Any misstep, any overt confrontation could ruin everything. And yet, the more I held back, the more the tension escalated. It was clear. The battle for our family's future had begun. And I was right in the middle of it, caught between loyalty, fear, and the knowledge that betrayal often comes from those we love the most. The morning started like any other, with the soft hum of the heater and the faint smell of brewed coffee drifting from the kitchen, but I could feel it in my bones. Today wouldn't be ordinary. I had sensed it all week. Lisa's unusually quiet demeanor, the glances she shared with her fiancé, the whispered phone calls that abruptly ended whenever I entered the room. Something was brewing, and I knew it was about to explode. I found my father in the living room, sitting stiffly in his favorite armchair, eyes fixed on the newspaper but clearly not reading a single word. He looked older, more fragile than usual, and the worry lines on his face seemed deeper, carved by sleepless nights and unspoken stress. I wanted to warn him, to tell him what I had discovered, but I knew he might dismiss my words as paranoia. It all began when Lisa casually mentioned her plans for the family estate. At first, her words sounded innocent enough, a suggestion about redecorating, a casual mention of selling some old furniture. But there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Her fiancé leaned in, smiling too widely, nodding approvingly at every sentence. Their eyes met briefly, and I caught that subtle, almost imperceptible signal. They were testing the waters, gauging my father's reactions. "You know, Dad," Lisa said softly, "I think it might be time to consider modernizing things a bit. We could even think about redistributing some of the assets. It's just practical, really." My father's eyebrows knitted together, his hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. "Redistributing? What do you mean?" Her fiancé chimed in, voice silky but firm. "It's just a thought, Mr. Harrison. Inheritance planning, asset management, making sure everyone is secure." I felt my chest tighten. The words were carefully chosen, polite but loaded with manipulation. They were slowly encroaching on our family, positioning themselves as the wise counselors, while my father, trusting as ever, wavered. Unable to stay silent any longer, I stepped forward. "Dad, please listen to me. They're trying to—" I stopped mid-sentence, realizing my father's gaze was locked on Lisa, searching for reassurance, and any overt accusation might backfire. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, her smile twisting. "Trying to what exactly? I'm just making suggestions. Is it so wrong to care about our family's future?" Her fiancé's hand brushed lightly against hers, a subtle, possessive gesture, but it carried the weight of a plan, a silent alliance. Tension crackled in the air. My mother, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke, her voice calm but pointed. "Perhaps we need to discuss this as a family, openly, without assumptions or pressure." The room went silent. I could feel the electricity in the air, the unspoken challenge hovering between us. Lisa's smile remained, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. My father looked lost, torn between trust and doubt. I realized in that moment that the first real confrontation had begun, not with shouting or anger, but with subtle maneuvering, manipulation wrapped in politeness. And as I watched them, my resolve hardened. I couldn't let this continue. I needed to act carefully, plan strategically, and wait for the right moment to protect my parents. Because if I miscalculated, we could lose everything, and I couldn't let that happen. That day marked a turning point. The game had begun, and every move from here on would count. It had been a week since that tense morning confrontation, and the atmosphere in our home had changed. Everything felt heavier, loaded with an invisible weight. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were consumed by the subtle but unmistakable signs of deceit I'd started noticing. Lisa and her fiancé were careful, too careful, leaving trails of their plans for me to piece together if I paid close attention. And pay attention I did. Every gesture, every whispered conversation, every innocent suggestion, they all had meaning, and I was beginning to decode it. It started with small things. Bills that didn't add up. Bank statements moved to accounts I hadn't authorized. Late-night trips that my father didn't remember scheduling. At first, I dismissed them as coincidences, but the pieces started forming a pattern of manipulation and control. Lisa's laughter, light and airy as it was, sometimes carried a sinister undertone, and her fiancé's constant hovering wasn't about concern. It was surveillance. One afternoon, while they thought no one was watching, I followed him to the study. He was going through my father's documents, carefully scanning contracts and letters. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to confirm my suspicions. They were planning to secure the house and assets in their names, quietly, methodically, before anyone could stop them. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just about money. It was about taking over the home that had been the heart of our family for decades. Later that night, I confronted my mother privately. Her face fell when I explained what I had seen, the worry lines on her face deepening. "I thought I knew them," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "How could they be so cruel?" I shook my head. "It's all calculated. They've been working together from the beginning. They've been playing a game with us, pretending to care while slowly taking control." My mother's hands trembled as she clutched mine. "We need to act, but we have to be careful. One wrong move and they could make everything disappear." The next few days were a tense balancing act. I couldn't openly accuse them yet. Lisa and her fiancé were too shrewd. Instead, I started documenting everything: phone calls, secret meetings, unusual transactions. Every bit of evidence was stored, every lie recorded. The truth needed to be undeniable when the time came. Then came the breakthrough. One evening, Lisa left her laptop unattended on the dining table. I opened it discreetly and discovered emails and messages that laid out their plan in shocking detail. They had schemed to gradually inherit the property and sell it, leaving my parents with nothing. The messages even included instructions on how to emotionally manipulate my father into signing documents, exploiting his trust and affection for his children. Reading those words, I felt a mix of anger and determination. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a calculated assault on the very people who had nurtured her. I realized then that knowledge was our weapon, and armed with this evidence, I finally had a chance to fight back, to protect my parents before it was too late. That night, I whispered to myself, "The game has been revealed, and now it's time to turn the tables." After uncovering the evidence, the first thing I did was sit down with my father. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, but there was a spark of curiosity when I gently placed the laptop in front of him. The emails, messages, and secret documents painted a picture so clear that even he couldn't deny it. I can't believe she would do this," he muttered, his voice breaking. His eyes, usually so calm and patient, now held a mix of shock and hurt. We knew the timing had to be perfect. Acting too soon could alert Lisa and her fiancé, making them more careful, more deceptive. Acting too late could mean losing everything. My father and I decided on a strategy, a calculated counterattack that required patience, precision, and secrecy. We would use their own tactics against them. The first step was to create a sense of false security. We pretended to remain unaware, keeping our daily routines as normal as possible. My mother, ever gentle and cautious, played her part perfectly, engaging with Lisa and her fiancé without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, I worked behind the scenes, documenting every move they made, noting their patterns and even planting small, controlled misinformation to confuse them. One evening, while Lisa and her fiancé were out celebrating a supposed business deal, My father and I met with a lawyer who specialized in family property disputes. We shared the evidence and outlined the manipulation we had discovered. The lawyer's eyes widened as he reviewed the messages. "You're in a strong position," he said. "If you proceed carefully, the law will be on your side. But you need to remain patient. Any hint that you know too much could backfire." Armed with legal advice and a plan, we began subtly reclaiming control. We adjusted property titles, ensured bank transactions required both parents' approval, and even set up surveillance measures. Not to spy maliciously, but to gather undeniable proof if needed. Every step was deliberate, a quiet but firm statement that the house and assets would not be taken without a fight. Meanwhile, I observed Lisa and her fiancé. They were confident, almost arrogant, believing their plan was foolproof. But subtle cracks began to appear. Small mistakes, forgotten emails, and inconsistent stories betrayed their growing anxiety. It was satisfying, though I kept my excitement hidden. The longer they underestimated us, the stronger our position became. One afternoon, I confronted them indirectly. A casual remark during lunch hinted at knowledge of their schemes. Lisa froze for a moment, and her fiancé's eyes darted nervously. The seed of doubt had been planted. They no longer moved as freely, constantly questioning if someone was watching, if their plans were unraveling. Finally, my father, with newfound resolve, asserted himself in family discussions. His voice was steady, authoritative, and no longer hesitant. It was the first time in weeks that Lisa and her fiancé felt the tables turning. They smiled politely, but it was forced, a mask to hide their unease. As I left the room that evening, I whispered to myself, "The battle has begun." And now we lead. We were no longer victims of manipulation. With patience, strategy, and careful planning, we were taking back our home and our lives, one deliberate move at a time. The tension had been building for weeks, like a storm quietly gathering strength over the horizon. Every move we made was calculated, every word carefully measured. Lisa and her fiancé were becoming increasingly careless, their confidence slowly eroding as they realized that perhaps they weren't as untouchable as they had thought. My father, once hesitant and weary, now walked with a quiet authority that made their smiles falter. It all came to a head one evening. We had arranged a family dinner, a seemingly casual gathering at the house, with my mother playing her usual welcoming hostess. Lisa, ever oblivious, had invited her fiancé, confident that this would be just another night of enjoying the fruits of their manipulation. But what they didn't know was that tonight, everything would come crashing down. I had positioned myself strategically, laptop in hand, ready to display the trail of evidence we had painstakingly collected. My father had rehearsed his words, speaking slowly, deliberately, ensuring his voice carried the gravity of truth without malice. My mother stood nearby, calm but resolute, a silent pillar of support. As the dinner progressed, I casually steered the conversation toward financial planning and property. Lisa laughed nervously, trying to maintain control, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Her fiancé, usually so confident and brash, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was time. I opened the laptop and projected the documents onto the wall. Emails, messages, and transaction records lay bare for everyone to see. Lisa's hand trembled slightly, her carefully constructed mask cracking. My father's voice broke the silence. "We trusted you, and you betrayed that trust. This isn't just about money, it's about family, about respect." Lisa tried to speak, to deflect, but her fiancé interrupted, panic rising in his voice. The lies they had woven so tightly began to unravel under the weight of undeniable evidence. My father, composed but firm, continued, explaining the manipulation, the deceit, the hidden schemes that they had orchestrated behind our backs. Each revelation hit like a hammer, echoing through the room. Then came the turning point. My father made the decision we had been building toward. With a steady hand, he signed the necessary documents reclaiming the house and assets, restoring our rightful ownership. Lisa and her fiancé realized too late that their control had evaporated. They tried to argue, to threaten, but the lawyer we had consulted weeks before was present, ensuring every legal safeguard was in place. I could see the desperation in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated us completely. They were powerless now. And yet, in the midst of this confrontation, I saw a spark of hope and relief in my father's eyes, a mix of vindication and newfound strength. My mother, usually soft-spoken, finally allowed herself a quiet smile, her calm authority shining through. As the night ended, Lisa and her fiancé were escorted out, stunned and defeated. My father, my mother, and I stood together, a family that had endured betrayal, manipulation, and deceit, and emerged stronger for it. I realized then that sometimes the hardest battles teach the most important lessons about trust, resilience, and the power of patience and strategy. Sitting with my father afterward, I whispered, "We did it. Together." And he simply nodded, a tear glistening in his eye, not of sorrow but of triumph. The final confrontation wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reclaiming of dignity, respect, and family unity. The morning after the confrontation felt strangely serene, almost surreal. The house, which had been a battlefield of lies and manipulation, now seemed to breathe with a newfound calm. My father and mother moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, reclaiming not just the physical space, but the sense of authority and dignity that had been stolen from them. I stayed close, documenting the details, making sure every step was careful and precise. The final chapter of this long, exhausting saga was about to unfold. Lisa and her fiancé were no longer just a threat. They were a problem that had to be solved legally. With the evidence we had gathered over weeks of surveillance, communication logs, and financial records, we filed a formal complaint. My father, who had never been fond of confrontation, now walked into the lawyer's office with a quiet determination. There was no anger, no vengeance, only a clear sense of justice. It was astonishing to see him transform from a weary, cautious man into a pillar of authority, ready to face the consequences of someone's wrongdoing. The legal proceedings were tense. Lisa's fiancé tried to manipulate the situation, claiming innocence, spinning elaborate stories, and attempting to intimidate us. But every lie was countered by meticulous evidence. The lawyer, experienced and unflappable, guided us through each step, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. And then came the day of the court hearing. The courtroom was packed, whispers of the scandal spreading like wildfire. I sat with my father, holding his hand, sensing both his nervousness and his resolve. My mother, ever composed, offered me a reassuring smile. As the case unfolded, the truth emerged like sunlight piercing through dense clouds. The court examined each document, each email, and each transaction with scrutiny. Witnesses corroborated our story, and the web of deception spun by Lisa and her fiancé began to unravel in real time. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. One could hear a pin drop whenever the judge's gavel struck. And then finally the verdict, guilty. The judge sentenced Lisa's fiancé to prison, citing fraud, manipulation, and abuse of trust. Lisa herself faced consequences, with restrictions placed on her access to family assets and responsibilities. Relief washed over the room, almost tangible, as justice had finally been served. With the legal matter settled, the next task was personal reconciliation. My father had been displaced, hurt by betrayal, and yet he carried himself with remarkable grace. It was my eldest sister, the one who had remained distant through much of the conflict, who stepped forward. She had been observing quietly, waiting for the right moment. And now she approached my father, tears glistening in her eyes. "Papa," she whispered, "let's go home." And in that moment something shifted. The emptiness, the sorrow, the anger, all of it melted away as father and daughter embraced. A reunion long overdue. Returning to the house together, my father finally felt the sense of belonging that had been stolen from him. We restored everything, the rooms, the memories, the routines that had been disrupted by deceit. And while the past could not be erased, the future was now in our hands. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, laughter and conversation flowed freely, filling spaces that had long been silent. My father looked at us, eyes shining, and said, "This house, this family, is ours again." It was a victory not just of law, but of resilience, patience, and unwavering determination. The betrayal had tested us. The manipulation had hurt us. But in the end, truth, courage, and family unity had prevailed. Lisa and her fiancé were gone from our lives, replaced by peace and security. My father, once weary and broken, had been restored, not only to his home, but to his dignity, respect, and place in the family. As I watched the sunset from the porch that evening, I realized that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully ours, protecting those we love, and never underestimating the power of truth. And with that, I knew this chapter had ended, and our family, stronger than ever, was finally free. Free.